Good afternoon to you. For Telesur, I'm Regan Devines in Caracas, Venezuela, and this is From the South. Thank you for being here with us. Human rights organizations in Colombia say the government has not complied with the amnesties which it announced a month ago as a gesture of goodwill in the context of the current peace negotiations in Havana. More on this with our correspondent Natalia Margarita in Bogota.
Human rights groups are still skeptical about the government's announcement that it will pardon 13 imprisoned FARC members. The announcement, which came 1 month ago, brought to an end a hunger strike in which political prisoners were demanding the release of inmates under critical health conditions.
The government's criteria in choosing 30 inmates to be pardoned was basically that those prisoners were charged with political crimes rather than their health condition. We believe that's somewhat a petty gesture, as the humanitarian request that was being made was the release of those whose critical health condition is incompatible with life in prison.
On his Twitter account, the FARC's chief negotiator said the rebel group has unilaterally set free 500 prisoners they were holding, while also criticizing the government's delay in releasing the FARC prisoners.
Our thoughts are with you, and we want to express all of our solidarity. We are aware of the despicable conditions of your imprisonment, the prison guards' repression, the enemy's pressure, and all the horrors of jail.
The FARC are not alone in their criticism. Various lawyers have denounced the inhumane and degrading treatments of inmates, particularly against political prisoners. On Christmas Eve, several FARC members were reportedly subjected to beatings and burns.
For the state, jails in Colombia are another arena of war. Those imprisoned in a Colombian jail are not considered as people outside the confrontation, as it should be according to the international law, but rather the state takes them as hostages and gives them enemy treatment in jail, which violates international humanitarian law.
Human rights organizations continue demanding the immediate release of at least 81 FARC prisoners who are under life-threatening conditions and are likely to die in jail if not released. Natalia Margarita, Telesur, Bogotá.
Authorities in Uruguay say the number of people displaced by the last week of floods has now risen to almost 17,000. The total across the region, including Paraguay, Argentina and Brazil, stands at around 180,000. The government is meeting to evaluate the losses and to plan relief operations. Most of the displaced in Uruguay are being sheltered in sports centers and other public buildings.
The departments of Artigas, Salto, Paysandú are the worst affected. The latest update on those displaced stands at almost 17,000. The actual number has not changed, but the number counted has increased because we have been insisting that those who chose to leave their homes register with the local or federal authorities so that help can be delivered to them.
The same region of South America is also facing a heat wave. Temperatures are up to 40 degrees centigrade in parts of Argentina, leading the authorities to issue an orange warning there. Further north, on the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, people are used to enjoying the heat. But this year, even some cariocas, as Rio's residents are known, are feeling the burn. With the temperature at 38 degrees, people are having to take precautions. The impact of climate change has had a devastating effect on Bolivia's second largest lake, Pupo. Within the last decade, the water in the lake has slowly ebbed away. Now that it's completely dry, local wildlife has been wiped out and the fishing industry collapsed. Approximately $115 million are needed to save the lake, as our Bolivia correspondent Dimitri O'Donnell explains.
This is all that remains of Lake Popo. Over the past 2 months, it's completely dried up. At an altitude of nearly 3,700 meters, the saltwater lake was once Bolivia's second largest body of water after Lake Titicaca. I'm standing in the middle of what used to be Lago Popo, 84 kilometers long, 54 kilometers wide. Now it resembles nothing more than a hot, dry desert. The flamingos, wild ducks and fish that used to live here have long gone or died, and biologists fear the natural ecosystem will take years to recover to what it once was. Climate change is partly to blame. Rising temperatures have resulted in accelerated evaporation of the water 3 times faster than normal, according to scientists.
In the next few months, it is predicted that the El Niño phenomenon will make it a dry year, and consequently, this will affect the flora and fauna of the Lake Popo.
The government has declared the area a disaster zone as fishermen have abandoned the lake and may never return.
We have an obligation to get to work and act. In this context, we will always prioritize life and only later material things. So firstly, we are devising humanitarian aid for our brothers who are not able to survive to guarantee their subsistence.
Small villages like Untavi, that long depended on the lake for a living, have seen most of their young people flee in search of work elsewhere.
Here, the people in my community are suffering, so each family is looking for work to live and keep our children, to keep them study. We keep looking.
Locals fear Popo will never recover its water because of rising temperatures. With the region continuing to struggle with drought-like conditions, the future is not looking bright for this once thriving lake. Dimitri O'Donnell, Telesur, Lake Popo, Bolivia.
Mexico's Colima volcano registered 2 eruptions on Monday. The explosions sent columns of ash 2,000 meters into the sky. On Christmas Eve, the volcano lit up the sky with burning rocks. Colima is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire and has been in almost constant activity since last July. Mexico has more than 3,000 volcanoes, but Colima is one of the only 14 that are considered active. Central American countries have agreed on a pilot scheme to take Cuban migrants across Guatemala and Mexico to the United States. About 7,000 Cubans are currently stranded in Costa Rica and Panama. The new scheme, to begin in January, would fly an initial group of Cubans to El Salvador, where they would be put on buses to travel northwards. Cuba has repeatedly criticized Washington for using the migration issue as a political tool. Costa Rica has now stopped issuing transit visas to Cubans. Peru has had its fair share of challenges in 2015, and the inability or ability of the head of state to confront those challenges has not gone unnoticed. Telesur's Ryan Morix reports.
2015 has been marked with rising social conflicts, both in numbers and intensity. One of the largest conflicts has to do with farmers in the south of Peru who opposed the Tia Maria mining project. Confrontations with the police, starting in April of this year, resulted in 4 protesters dead. Nevertheless, those who oppose the project have shown they are determined to continue mobilizing.
At 2 in the afternoon, we are already a sea of people, and nobody has changed our position with respect to this project. In the Valley of Tambo, we continue to be strong, and nobody changes our position, and we will not rest until this Tia Maria project is definitely gone and cancelled.
Other intense conflicts have to do with concessions of indigenous land to foreign companies who have historically contaminated the areas. For instance, in September of this year, Quichua and Ashuar communities from the region of Loreto in the north of the country invaded oil fields, paralyzed the crude production, and demanded land titles for the communities.
Today, there is a total discontent, and we have declared a permanent mobilization in our territories to not allow more abuses and more violation of our rights.
The projects that have caused social conflicts are part of neoliberal development plans that President Ollanta Humala promised to reverse during elections.
They have been generating stimulus for social protests with the laws that started last year, making environmental regulations and tributary policies more flexible, and also by some labor market deregulations, from which the strongest is the so-called youth employment law.
The situation has negatively impacted public opinion about Humala, who has reached his lowest approval ratings this year. The latest poll released in late November shows only 11% of citizens support the president, and no candidate from his party appears on the polls for the presidential elections set for next April. Rael Mora, Telesur, Peru.
The decision not to indict the police officer who shot 12-year-old Tamir Rice back in 2014 has sparked protest action not only in Cleveland but also in New York City. That decision led anti-police brutality and human rights activists to gather at Washington Square Park on Monday night, where they eventually marched across the Brooklyn Bridge. The Rice family have since released a statement calling the local criminal justice system corrupt. We go live now to Washington, to our correspondent Bianca Perez. Hi Bianca, great touching base with you. Now we've seen a lot of anger spread across social media over this case. What have been the specific reactions that you've been seeing in Cleveland?
How are you, Regan? Nice to touch base with you as well. There's been a lot of action, not only in Cleveland, but in different parts of the country. As you mentioned, there was a big manifestation last night in New York. There's also going to be one tonight in Baltimore, and there are smaller ones throughout the nation. People just feel indignation. The family has called for the Justice Department to investigate and to look into this case because they chose not to indict any sort of charges on these police officers, saying that there was no reasonable cause, that the gun that he was using, which was a toy gun, looked a lot like a real gun. Therefore, it was a human error, which has risen a lot of criticism from social media. It's also valid to mention that the 911 dispatcher was told that it could have been a toy gun during various times throughout the phone call, but that dispatcher failed to mention this to the police officers. So this was another reason that led to the grand jury saying that since the police officers were not informed, they acted on a normal basis, assuming that this was a gun. Obviously outrage in the community as they feel that this is just another case with no justice being seen in these police brutality cases, which have continuously grown throughout the year, and people want action. So hopefully the family is hoping that the Justice Department will do a full investigation of this and that more action will be taken in this particular case.
Thank you so much, Bianca. You've pretty much answered my questions there. Thanks for touching base. We will catch up with you another time. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Regan. I appreciate it.
Moving on now, Homeland Security authorities in the United States are formulating a plan for the deportation of more than 100,000 families who entered the country as undocumented immigrants back in 2014. More with Bianca Perez.
Immigration continues to be a highly debated topic in the United States. A renowned publication recently revealed that the Department of Homeland Security is planning to deport some 100,000 undocumented families that entered the country in 2014. The period represented one of the largest influx of migrant families and minors in recent memory.
We know that the majority of people that arrived, of family units and children that arrived last year, do not have legal representation. So they do obviously have problems formulating their claim in front of a migration judge.
2,700 people, most of which are mothers and their children, are currently held in detention centers in Texas and Pennsylvania. Though these facilities were created to hold detainees for a period of no longer than 72 hours, many have been awaiting their court dates for months.
It really represents the way that people are forced to suffer, that people are being punished for being here with undocumented status.
Analysts from the Migration Policy Center state that when immigrants are deported back to their home countries, they face conditions which are worse than those they originally left behind.
They may be indebted to their smugglers and have to pay back or find a way to pay back between $6,000 and $9,000 US. They're often faced with the same types of violence and poverty that drove them out in the first place. And the services to receive and to reintegrate them into the societies in the Northern Triangle are really nascent. They're insufficient to date.
The Department of Homeland Security has not yet confirmed nor denied that massive deportations will take place. However, they maintain that a definitive solution is needed to solve the immigration problem in the U.S.
It's disappointing that the Senate passed a good comprehensive immigration reform bill in 2013 by a significant bipartisan margin, but that the House has not done the same thing to fix our broken immigration system.
Between October 2014 and September 2015, the Department of Homeland Security deported more than 235,000 individuals. At the same time, more than 337,000 were arrested at the U.S.-Mexico border trying to cross into the country. Bianca Perez, Telesur, Washington, D.C.
In Pakistan, a suspected suicide bomber has killed at least 22 people and injured at least 30 more in the town of Mardan. The bomb exploded outside the National Database and Registration Authority. The attack was claimed by a faction of the Pakistani Taliban and is one of the deadliest since the massacre of 150 students and teachers in Peshawar in December last year. As the people of Palestine look towards the new year, they hold out hope for a better life. Here is Noor Harzin with more.
The situation is calm and peaceful in the West Bank and Gaza today as the people of Palestine are welcoming 2006. However, and unfortunately, the situation in the Gaza Strip is still going from bad to worse. It has been almost 9 years since Israel has imposed its siege on the Gaza Strip. Here the residents are suffering the lack of clean water, the lack of fuel, which led to only 6 hours of electricity per day, also the lack of building materials and some of the basic needs here in the Gaza Strip. However, the residents here are hopeful that the next year will be a beginning to a better life for the residents of Gaza and the Palestinian territories.
And Noor Harzin now looks back at one of the most important events of the year, the third Palestinian Intifada.
The third Intifada, or the Knives Uprising, broke out in Jerusalem and the West Bank at the beginning of October and gradually extended to include Gaza Strip and the occupied territories, marking the most important and remarkable event in Palestine in 2015. In September, extremist Jewish organizations and rabbis made calls arguing all Jewish settlers to storm the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The calls sparkled a wave of unstoppable violence and raised panic and suspicions between both the Arabs and the Israelis.
The third Intifada did not occur randomly. It was the result of bitter measures that were carried out by the Israeli forces against the Palestinian people in Jerusalem. The Israelis wanted to impose a temporal division on the Holy City, and then they started attacking worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. However, the Intifada launched in an effective way after the Itamar operation in Nablus, and then the Palestinian crowds took to the street with stones and knives. They began run-over operations against Israeli security forces and settlers.
Israeli settlers burned the home of the Adawabsha family in the West Bank city of Nablus in July. The attack resulted in killing all the members of the family with the exception of 5-year-old Ahmed. As a result, Palestinians carried out a series of stabbing, run-over and shooting attacks against the Israelis, the most important of which was the Itmar operation in the West Bank city of Nablus, in which 2 Israelis were killed and 3 were injured. Meanwhile, Palestinian media outlets reported that a total of 117 Palestinians were killed and more than 14,000 were injured since October, in contrast to 20 dead Israelis and 315 who were reported injured in Palestinian attacks since October. Noor Harzin, Telesu TV, Palestine.
2 people have been arrested by Belgian police on suspicion of planning attacks in Brussels. Police conducted raids on Sunday and on Monday where they seized military clothing and computer equipment. However, no weapons or explosives were found. The suspects are accused of planning attacks against several so-called symbolic targets in the capital as well as on the police. According to prosecutors, the latest arrests are not linked to the Paris attacks. You can join us on Facebook, Instagram and on Twitter for more on these and other stories, and for extensive coverage on developing stories, please visit our website telesurtv.net/English. For Taylor Suit English, I'm Regan Levines. Have a safe day. Bye.